Hello, my name is Eliza Cortes Bast, and I have the privilege of serving the Church of Jesus as the coordinator for local missional engagement and special projects for the Reformed Church in America. Today, I'm so excited to talk a little bit with leaders and pastors about how they can equip their congregations to share the good news of the gospel. What I find in a lot of churches is that there's a sense of nervousness and anxiety. What if I get something wrong? What if I don't say a scripture correctly? What if I misquote Jesus? And so here I am today to give you just a few practical tidbits that will help your congregation be able to better share what they're learning from the scriptures and how God is speaking to them and what that means when they share the good news with their friends. So, we talk a lot about what the gospel is, and we sense a sense of anxiety as people start wondering, do I need to write this down on a napkin? All the ways that we learned growing up. And so here, I'm asking you to consider a few things as we reconsider what it means to share the gospel through the scriptures. There are a few scriptures I would like to point you to. As I've been training and equipping particular churches, I've been asking some of their lay leaders and some of their people who are interested in evangelism to consider a few things. These three stories that are found in the gospel texts are pictures of where the miraculous has happened and Jesus has shown up. The first, Matthew 14, is where Jesus feeds the 5,000 and the crowds experience the miraculousness of God's provision for them, and there's 12 baskets of food left over. In John 8, we see where the woman is caught in adultery and she has an experience with Jesus where she is radically forgiven. And then in Matthew 16, we see where Peter gets a new name, where he is wrestling with Jesus and affirms who Jesus is. As you consider equipping and training your leaders, consider where the gospel happens in these three stories. Many folks would jump to saying, well, I have to be able to clearly articulate what happened at the cross. But consider that if we understand that the redeeming story of Jesus is a narrative that reflects the entire body of scriptures, then we can go back to these three stories and start unpacking where we see the gospel at work. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, we see not only a miracle of God's ultimate provision for our practical needs, but we see where the disciples are stretched in their faith. We see where a young boy has what he has in his hands miraculously multiplied for the good of the entire body. In John 8, where we see the woman who's caught in adultery, we also see our clear call to release our judgmental behaviors, and that we are also to embrace our own sinfulness and experience the forgiveness that Jesus brings. And then last, in Matthew 16, we understand that part of the gospel narrative is we get a new name as our identities are being renewed daily by Jesus and our willingness to follow him. Would we consider these three scriptures to be gospel stories? Absolutely, and we recognize the gospel is happening in each one of them. And so I would ask you to consider, as you are equipping your congregation, ask them to consider the entirety of the scriptures. You can ask questions like, what scriptures are speaking to you now? What stories are you wrestling with? Where do you find yourself in the scripture today? And then begin training your people to understand, where is the gospel happening in that scripture? Where do you see the gospel interacting with you? Where do you see the redeeming and renewing and renaming work of Jesus and everything that you're experiencing? In this way, it releases the people that are part of your congregation to start interacting with their neighbors and their friends, the people that they're sitting next to in the coffee house or at the soccer game, to understand that the scripture and the gospel is happening to them every day too. It releases them from having to get it right, but actually moves them into a place where they're digging deeper into their own story and understanding and recognizing where Jesus was at work and the Spirit of God was at work through the entirety of the Gospels. In this way, you help train your congregation to understand and seek Jesus in whatever they're maneuvering through and moving through and wrestling with. It also encourages them to start articulating how the gospel is being experienced by them, their family, their marriage every day. And in this way, it removes them from feeling the tension of having to be a theologian, for having to get it right, to being afraid of misquoting Jesus, and actually saying, this is where I'm at in the scriptures today, and this is where I see the good news of Jesus for me today. It's also part of our discipleship journey. And in this way, we move people closer and closer to saying, I could tell you about the good news of Jesus.